Welcome back to Cut the Chat Life Science Insider. This week's episode is hosted by SUS Plus CEO and co-founder Kieran Canisius.
Welcome and happy that you are all here today. And I'm so very excited to welcome Joel White, owner of Marketcap Consulting. And why I am so excited is that Joel and I, over the last few years, have been speaking together and learning from each other. Actually, me learning from him is how it started. Joel has a very, very extensive experience. I think more than 40 companies on 70 projects working together with the vendors that our audience and Zeus's clients are utilizing on how to structure finance, responsibility, accounting, budgets, proposals, bid grids, and many more. And I'm sure Joel will tell us a little bit more about that in a minute. But what I've always loved about our interaction is that it reminds me of the complexity and the intricacy of the interaction of the vendors we interact with. And it teaches me about what are those drivers and how do we better understand each other. So I'm very excited to introduce Joel and happy to have you join me today.
Well, same to you. Great having you. I think this is going to be a very unique conversation for anyone who's familiar with each of our work.
Yeah. I often have conversations with investors or with biotech leaders who are flabbergasted at the big numbers, about the unclarity, about the how is this built. And that's why I think today would be excellent to talk about the proposal specifically created by CROs. It's a big percentage of the expenditure on a fund for a clinical development by a stage biotech company. They are looking to execute, to gather data, to prove safety, to prove efficacy, to prove scalability, right? And to get it approved to the market, to be able to bring it to the patients that so many of these biotech leaders are so passionate about. Many of these small biotechs, their assets are owned and founded and managed and developed by individuals who long earlier in their career became passionate about a disease area or an indication area that either has a personal reflection or it has very intrinsic to their own motivation. So when we start talking business and money and clarity on how much something is going to cost, it becomes very difficult when you want to achieve something and the finances just aren't clear. Like when you go into the supermarket, you know that eggs are going to cost X amount. That's probably not the right example to use right now in the world, what the cost of eggs are, but it is true. It's what we feel comfortable with, the standard, the mundane. Something costs something. And I think the challenge that we see is that it's unclear, it's not transparent, and oftentimes ported into a way that it is kept in the gray zone. So that's what I love about this conversation is I'd love to ask you some questions.
Yeah, I'll just say, the price of eggs are out of your control, which makes it frustrating. And that can be a similar feeling, for folks, especially in the small, medium-sized biotechs where maybe this is their first or first few years that they're getting accustomed to this and they feel like working with a CRO and their pricing and their budgeting is out of their control and that they have to accept what's given them. To some extent, that's true. But to some extent, you can influence how much those things change or how you scope it. And so it's not as dire as the price of eggs and you showing up and you just got to pay whatever you're at the facility you're in.
Yeah. And I agree. I think the proposal moment is the first time we start talking about the money and what something will cost based on assumptions. And as those assumptions change, sometimes those unit costs are also influenced. And because there's a volatility in some of this, right? At the beginning, we are agreeing goalposts. What do we need to achieve that? What numbers are we aligning to? Patient numbers, site numbers, locations, things that influence the cost that are not always clear at proposal stage. But I would love to ask you this question first. So from your perspective, what are the most common misunderstandings or misconceptions that sponsors or small biotech companies have about CRO pricing? So when they are seeing in a proposal or in a bid grid.
Yeah. I think that there's a conception that CRO budgets are rigid and that they are very standardized, where in reality, pretty much every CRO has a different platform for its pricing, especially amongst the larger CROs or really any CRO. No two CROs pricing tools look the same. There may be a couple CROs out there that have bought into some of the kind of common use platforms out there, which I won't name. The overwhelming vast majority of CRO pricing is done in Microsoft Excel, and will be for many years, is my estimation. So maybe they're on the same application from that standpoint, but they've all developed their own customized, configurable tools. And full disclosure, I mean, that's part of what I build for a living. I've never built two that look the same. There's no Joel White CRO pricing tool out there that I work with a CRO and I just plug their numbers in, but the tool looks the same as anyone else's. That's because no two CROs are different, even if they can feel like they're commoditized in many ways. So to kind of get back to your question, a CRO's tool, it will have standard rates, for people that they charge out the project. It will have standard hours for most tasks, and for maybe technology and licensing and things like that, there will be standard pricing, and that tends to be more rigid. But every full proposal is heavily customized for every opportunity. Maybe not so much the ballparks. If you're in fundraising mode and you send a little one pager that says, hey, give me a price for this, you'll probably get a pretty standardized output because the CRO is not going to want to spend too much time on that. But if you send a real phase 2 study to a group of CROs, they're going to go away with their teams and they're going to analyze that thing in depth. And especially like the less detail you provide in your RFP, if you send it to 4 CROs, you're going to get 4 very different sets of conversations within those companies, and they're going to heavily customize their tools to produce their budgets. And we're just talking about the budget pricing side of it. Mm-hmm. They're all going to have different strategies they employ. They're going to have the work resourced from different areas, and where they plan to resource a phase 2 study in an RFP you send them will probably be different than what they do next week when they get an RFP from ABC Biotech. So I think the key point is that there is a lot of intense customization by every CRO for every real RFP opportunity. And it's not just you're plugging in 50 sites, 10 months, et cetera. The price comes out, you zip it off.
I think that also explains, we have lots of conversations, especially with teams under pressure, under time pressure and in a rush. We're like, oh, they could turn this around in XYZ amount of time. In a few days, they can turn around a complete budget, or they can turn around a complete proposal. I think that's, having also been on the CRO side, that's, even if the teams would want to, or the company is engaged to rush that moment, it's indeed very complex and very tailored, and is based on a gazillion assumptions
yes.
at that moment. So I agree. That's
why,
the case.
Some biotechs wish that CROs were more on a common platform, just like there's a lot of common outsourcing platforms that biotechs and pharmas can use to say, hey, CRO, put your budget in here. Well, why can't I have my CRO just price in that system too? It's the gazillions of assumptions you talk about. Different CROs have different assumptions, and the more that you force them into your assumptions, the more you're going to get budgets back that will change in unexpected ways throughout the life cycle of the project.
Yeah, so it's a balance between giving rigidity so we have comparability at an initial stage, at least because at the RFP stage, we're choosing between, right? And we're identifying which CROs are financially unachievable, because that is the case in some cases. This is not a viable outcome, and which are potentially, there's also a very clear who is underpricing to be able to get in, and therefore the risk for change orders is therefore higher. Right?
Of course, yeah. That's the nature of our industry and other industries. We're not alone in this. You'll get this sense sometimes that the clinical research industry is 100% unique in this way. You look at any industry that involves long-term projects, so like large office construction, airplane construction, things like that. It's a world of change orders, because long-term projects with people providing services, that's the case. It's not the case in software. You're providing a platform and you buy it for 3 years, you can fix that in. But
which has its own overpricing issues, by the way.
Yeah, of course. And talk about something you have less control over as a sponsor. But when you have people providing services globally in an industry where things are constantly changing, where it's highly regulated, those regulations change, administrations change, things like that. Your initial assumptions, most of which are contracted before you have a final protocol that guides the study, a protocol that will often change throughout the study, you're going to have change orders. There's, no few change orders are pleasant, but they
Sometimes they just are.
Yeah, they're a fact of life. Yeah, they're a fact of life. Some are not a fact of life, and then that's where you've got to be smart on your outsourcing. But yeah, they to expect a 5-year oncology trial to not have any change orders
Is naive.
It's naive. Yes, it is. Yeah.
And I think in certain cases we have, there's bad behavior on both sides, right? And I do see that, or bad, less than professional or in
It's on a
having
scale,
like
right?
handling without
Yeah.
integrity is also there. But there's also a lot of forgetting with change orders and scope changes. It's also to remind what we agreed. And if we're reviewing what is being spent or what is being done, then there are going to be changes. Some things are fluctuating. And because we changed something 6 months ago, now we're seeing an impact on our budget. I think that the problem is that it's not signaled on time. It's not agreed up front. And therefore it's in hindsight, and already everyone's annoyed. We start in the conversations from, but we already did the work. Yeah, but I didn't know you were doing it. It's like going to a restaurant and then they've fed you all kinds of side dishes. In Italy, you get a plate of bread. And as a silly, unexperienced tourist, you eat it and then all of a sudden see it on your bill. And the amount of conversations that tourists have about that's ridiculous. I'm like, it's bread, first of all, and the cost is not that high,
Yeah.
but it's the feeling of unfair that's so loud. And I think that that's one of the issues that we definitely see in this process is there is a human emotional reaction to this thing. You are relying on someone you would call a partner at that stage to use their expertise and experience to say, this is what we think you're going to need to do it. And then along the way, that trust and partnership erodes to get to the point of, but those assumptions all changed, or it's taking us a lot longer to do source data verification. The source data is still the same as what it was when we signed the work order, which is post-proposal. What do you mean it took longer?
Yeah. So, Kieran,
there's an accountability that is interestingly placed in the hands of those who are paying. Later on.
The first question you asked me was what's like some of the misconceptions. Well, what's not a misconception, what does have a large basis in reality is that CROs can be very irresponsible with change orders. And not always even irresponsible in an intentional way. It's that I talk about these pricing tools and things like that. Some of these things are set up to fail the customer. And so, I've written about mixed units before. So, plenty of units are not mixed and they're perfectly straightforward. And so it will say that for a monitoring visit, the CRO assumption will be that, okay, to price out that monitoring visit, we will assume X hours per visit. And then that way, when you do the change order, unless there's some weird geography thing in there, the unit price will stay relatively constant. But then you'll get some of these other units where the actual build of the CRO unit will have multiple drivers in it that are rarely transparent to the sponsor. So what that means is you could have a unit like data, like your clinical database design. The customer will see a unit that says one unit for $120,000. And they'll think, okay, great, that's my fixed price for the trial, and no comment off to the right that says, oh, this is based on 32 unique CRFs and a build timeline of 6 weeks and so on and so forth. But underneath the hood of the CRO pricing tool, yes, there will be a one-time fixed effort, but there will also be a price per unique CRF. They might have the edit checks embedded into that unit. And you're never going to know at the study outset how many edit checks you're ultimately going to do, especially where you have like thousands of them now. Like if you say, we're going to have 1,011 edit checks, it's not going to be 1,011, right? Those are the types of things that you need to split off into their own unit. So that way, if it's $5 a check, okay, well, if you ultimately do 1,000 instead of 1,011, or you do 1,050, you can see, okay, the actual hard truth was we did that many, but at least my unit price didn't change. So when I talk about like these mixed units, and as much as possible, try to have a one-to-one relationship between how you construct your price and then how you send your unit to the customer. That's why. And it's almost impossible to do that 100%, but there's always dramatic room for improvement. That's what I do in my benchmarking work. And there's always room for improvement on that. So, that's not a misconception that, gosh, it seems like the stuff that pricing is based on, it seems to change. Well, it's because it can often be a mixed story. underneath the hood.
And it's interesting, once it's in whatever system that they're using, it becomes the truth. And yes, but that's how many units. And we have, it sometimes makes me smile because I look at myself 20 years ago in discussions with clients to say, but this is what, not what my sheet is telling me, but I'm happy to get on the barricades to defend. This is what it needs to be. But many times we're having conversations with people who don't actually know what's under the hood, and feel very adamant to defend what is on paper, or what is coming out of the system. And then with that is that we then end up having human discussions and arguments and friction, where there's a financial mechanism behind it, that we start, the first thing under a proposal is we start to decide which one of these we don't want to fall in love with because we can't afford. It's like looking for a car. We may want to drive. Okay, name a favorite one. I don't name an Aston Martin. We may want to drive a beautiful car, but we can afford a second-hand Volkswagen Polo or a Lada, and it will still get you to a certain location. With higher risk, it may break down. You may get laughed at on the way. But those are decisions. And some of those decisions are made up front by a sponsor saying, I really can't. I may want the Rolls Royce. An outsourcing manager from Lilly at some point said, this was many, many years ago. This was when I was working at Icon. We are happy to pay for the Rolls Royce as long as it is the Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
We are not happy to pay for the Rolls Royce and get the Lada. And that stuck with me because that's exactly this process. At a proposal stage, we're very high. Our sponsors, our small biotechs, are very highly depending on the reliability, the integrity, and the experience that a CRO has to price something. And there's lots of tools out there. We work with some of them to say, and we have our own data to say, this seems a little bit off. And it's interesting to see the indignation of, but what do you mean? That's what it costs. I'm like, that's what your tool is saying it costs. But it's interesting that your tool is saying that because that seems really off. But it becomes a human interaction. I think it's a fun part of this is that there's a reason why we choose between different CROs or different vendors in general, is because they distinguish themselves in different ways. And one of those ways is cost. But one of the ways the relationship is highly damaged is when that's not transparent, not in control, and not managed like it's part of the business, not managed that it's becomes this, like contract negotiation. It's, we need to now talk about money. Yep, because what we are paying for needs to be delivered in the way it's being agreed to be delivered, and we will pay for that. It's when that becomes gray, that's when we get so much friction on the line and break down trust to a point of really rescue disaster in a lot of ways.
That's what's great about this conversation is I think that we'll have a large mix of people from both the CRO and larger service provider side and the outsourcing side, the biopharma side. And I hope that there's some takeaways from this is that if you're a CRO, you need to constantly be making yourself as easy to do business with over the long term as possible. And transparency and pricing is important. Does not mean you should or need to hand your pricing tool over to the sponsor or give them a demo of it, or take on their system that they're asking you to do all your pricing in. Doesn't mean that you have to do those things, but it does mean that you said maybe in version 1 the sponsor is looking at the total price, but as you get into the length of the relationship, you can really destroy things by constantly changing your pricing for things that they cannot expect. And then on the vendor management side, which you're the expert of, not me, but if I was on that side, that is something that I would really hold CROs really tightly accountable for. That if I'm paying 10 units of something at $500 a unit, and then now you say the unit is $550, and it was something I could not reasonably expect. That's a legitimate pushback. All the years I was in house, that was always the hardest one to explain, and it's a lot of what brought me to how I approach these things today. And it's typically one of the first things that you just adjust because you're like, well, I don't have a good reason, to really dig my feet in on that, so I'll move back to 500. But the best thing to do is to avoid that confrontation at the beginning, and not even saying, oh, you should just roll over. It's just like set up your tools and your finances so you don't need to change that from 500 to 550.
Yeah, we are seeing evolution at least within small biotech and pharma, is that there is an inclination to have control, transparency, visibility, and management of that. And it's interesting because I hear from quite a lot of CROs, we never have this issue with any other biotech clients. And I always think that just can't be true, because a lot of what we do as well is really looking at the finance side. And
it's hard for me to hear that, because CROs hate it when a biopharma says, we've never seen that from a CRO over things that you see every week. So for me to hear you say CROs are saying that makes me very,
like yesterday,
very sad.
So that's not even long ago yesterday.
That makes me very sad. Yes.
But I think that's actually part of the problem, is that I am 100% will stand on a barricade for any CRO or vendor to say to any one of my clients, you asked for it, or you managed it in this way, therefore you pay for it. You changed scope. It is what it is. Or the way you've managed this is unfair. I think that's why Sabine and I have always said, Zeus does not live in sponsor or vendor side. It's how we are able to make sure that everyone is driving to execution together. So the article I just finished this morning is execution is sexy, because I think I'm so happy that we're starting to pay attention to what has been the mundane, and that part of that is also the finance side. It's the scary, or it's the contracts, or I think that's a super important part to maintain trust, transparency, and integrity. And I agree with you. I think there is a lot more variability that as soon as it's an Excel sheet, we all think that's what the number is.
Yeah.
But it is very important. This is one of the pillars on which the trust is built. And if you wanted to give I'd love if you would give some advice to our sponsors, so to the smaller biotech and pharma, is how can they be more strategic in budgeting, or requesting that information, or getting that information? How could they be more strategic in that, in the proposal stage? I mean, I know how our clients do it, and I'm not so concerned about us not being able to do that. I would love to hear from you, if you were going to advise any other biotech, how they could best be more strategic to avoid or to manage having control of those numbers up front.
All right. So you're talking about how to get more accurate and durable quotes and budgets in the earlier stages. Yeah. So I'd say geared especially towards the smaller and medium size. If you are sending CROs something just for fundraising purposes, just say it. Say it. You can. I will never really get in trouble for this. It's when you don't say it, and CROs have to kind of figure out and not give you the benefit of doubt of what your ultimate motive is. That's where you get thrown way down to the bottom of the pile, and you will just get that generic ballpark output. But if you say, hey, look, we are in our fundraising stage right now. We expect that over this certain timeline, this will become a real opportunity. You're still just going to get a ballpark budget back, because that's really all it should be. You don't know sites, countries, you might know patients or have a good idea, but nothing about it is final. Everything is preliminary. But you're going to get a much better ballpark with a lot more thought into it than if you weren't. Whereas if you say, oh, hey, we've got this amazing program coming up, and it starts in 12 months, which is the first cue, like, oh, this isn't serious. And it's almost like you're trying to sell yourself to the CROs who are responding to you, so that way you get the most accurate quote possible. Well, CROs are pretty good at reading into that, especially over the past 6 months, where there's 12 months where it's just well known by now that you've got just the quality of RFPs, and I put air quotes around that, it has just really deteriorated amongst smaller biotechs.
It has,
who are sending RFPs that are really fundraising exercises. So at the ballpark stage, whether you're a small biotech fundraising, or you're a larger pharma preparing your budget for next year, and you're just not ready to send a real RFP yet, if you're fundraising or budgeting, just say it. And if a CRO really wants to work with you, they'll engage. You're not going to get a nice, beautiful proposal with a full study strategy and all those things, and a super line item detailed budget that'll be the same 6 months from then, but you'll get a much better output. At the RFP stage itself, I can't put it down to one factor, but just one thing that always stood out to me, probably the best example I'd ever seen of a way to send an RFP that controlled future scope change, that stayed a durable budget, was, and I don't know if they still do it, but in the old days, Kieran, Gilead used to send these RFPs, and I mentioned their name because they should be proud of this. They used to send RFPs that were basically draft contracts, typically with a final protocol. And basically, as a CRO, you were filling out a contract. you were sending back a draft contract. It wasn't necessarily signature ready. And, maybe the final protocol wasn't truly final, but you always felt like as a CRO, when you got that RFP, this was serious business. And they always followed through on the sponsor side. And so, you did what you were supposed to do. You came to the bid defense. You were always just one of 2, 3, or 4 CROs, and then that was cut down by 1 or 2 for the bid defense. You always knew that when you got an RFP from them, it was
you
game
were
time.
Actually in the game. You
needed
count the percentage. Yeah.
You needed to put your best foot forward price wise in version 1. And I'll just use that as an example of probably the best that I've seen it done, because it just made everything more serious. From constructing an RFP and things like that, I think your audience would probably be best served from hearing from from you on that. But
I'd love to hear outside of the complaints of the rigidity and the amount of information we ask for, because it's what we use to compare. We're always very, very driving. Before actually we send an RFP, we spend all of our time determining, clarifying, driving as much clarity as possible, and limiting the list as much as possible to CROs. Because I think that one thing that I think is a misconception, or there's a sense from a small biotech, or generally from pharma sponsor at all, is we're going to give you an RFP. You're involved. But there is actually a currency that needs to be paid by everyone who receives that. We see certain CROs who actually have a gatekeeping at the front door to say, nope, we're not going to spend time on this. We're not going to spend time on this. We're not going to spend time on this. And I love that. I compliment that.
It's called the triage
process.
MedPace
does that. Yep. PSI does that. And there's some others as well.
All the bigs have a triage process, as they should.
And it takes, but some are more rigid than others. But it gives also us the confidence that this is something they're going to be taking seriously, and what they're going to do with it is actually bring the correct strategics and minds to the table to make those assumptions. Because that's in essence that process. They may not exactly know everything. Indeed, number of CRF pages is determined as well with the CRO. It's a huge cost driver, right? Because it has a lot of roll on. It's oftentimes way past the proposal phase, because we're then defining CRF and therefore pages, and therefore we're assuming that there's an assumption can be made by a CRO about what we expect in comparison to other comparable studies. But there is a seriousness, and I think a respect that needs to be given to every vendor in the time they spend on proposals. Because when you're tailoring, you said it already in the beginning, is that one of the misconceptions is that it's standardized, the bid sheets and the pricing, is that therefore it costs a lot of time to get something over the line. What I would love is that we take that same amount of effort and time with what is given in a bid sheet, because when CRO vendors and CROs are working with us, there is definitely effort, and I appreciate that very much, because we see it's done, but that there's also an accountability that's attached to that later when we're saying, so explain to me how this unit price has changed in 3 months due to inflation. I'm not quite understanding that one. Or, yeah, we kind of figured out maybe it was going to be, no. This is 1 page. The page is the same. The page was the same 3 months ago as today. Like, tell me again. And the amount of non-accountability, or I call it CYA, that cover your, we spend, like, it wasn't my fault. And if I was involved, let me show you all the documentation why it's not my fault. And otherwise, the contract wasn't clear enough. No, for Christ's sakes, you said this was going to cost this much. This is what has in my pocketbook. Why do you think that there's an unlimited source? I would love that. So with the amount of respect and time and effort it costs to put together a good bid grid at the beginning, would also come with a responsibility to stick to that as much as possible. And I'm always wondering whether small biotech are arguing for the wrong things. So do you think that when they come into, when there is, let's say not disagreement, friction on the line, do you think that sponsors are actually challenging bad forecasting? Because many times I hear it's more effort. And when it's a unit price, I'm like, well, that's interesting response to, we have a unit. Why am I paying for effort? It's one of the other. I understand it from a CRO perspective. I've worked there, but it's more from a client's perspective. It's still the same number of units. Where do you think that sponsors should be looking in terms of where are the areas that they're missing that are actually potentially need to be clarified upfront more strictly in order to drive that accountability? Because no one loves these conversations of what I laughingly call boss fights at the end where you've got all of the executives huddling around going who's going to take what percentage of this accountability pie. No one loves it. No one thinks it's fun. How do we change?
A few thoughts on that. I'm going to make a very brief comment about something you said earlier in that string. I just pointed out to my CRO friends that the two CROs you mentioned with a tighter triage process just happened to be probably the two top performing CROs financially over the past few years. And I'll just leave it at that. So there is
we'll leave it at that. But yeah, I did mention them for a reason as well.
There is profit in filtering the good from the not so good. Okay, so but to your question about bad forecasting, versus legitimate change. First of all, if you're a small biotech and you have a tough time figuring that out, there are people out there, including the person I'm speaking to now, who are experts that have seen hundreds, probably thousands of these situations and can advise you. So, don't do it alone if you feel like you can't get to the bottom of whether a large change order is valid or not. And I say that because part of the reason that these things get so charged and so emotional is that for especially smaller biotechs, one or two studies could be the large majority of their corporate spend in a given year. So you should be charged up about reviewing a change order, because a change order is a change to your business. It is a change to your corporate budget. If you're publicly traded, it's a change that may have to be disclosed to your investors. It may cause you to have to raise a dilutive round or additional shares or tank your stock price.
Or more emotionally, fire your internal staff because you can't carry it all.
Fire your internal staff, or be the founder who loves the business but no longer has majority control and the board gets rid of you. It's never a fun feeling. So, these things are important. And for any CRO out there that works primarily with especially small biotech, you have to understand that the stakes are immense for your customers with these. And that is something I would say is quite unique about this industry, is that for service providers, your customers are a group of companies typically with no revenue of their own, 100% dependent on external financing, and the vast majority of what they spend is with companies like you. And so any unexpected changes that you make to their financials, far more impactful than a dollar change to the price of eggs for an individual, to go back to the beginning of our conversation. So one, you have to absolutely take it seriously. So bad forecasting versus genuine change. One is, I always encourage CROs to document and explain any change that you're making, whether it's a change to the number of units or a given item, because at the end of the day, a CRO budget is the sum of the tasks, the units, the services being performed. And so if you are changing a particular unit from 10 units at $500 for $5,000 to 15 units, maybe the unit price stays the same, maybe it doesn't. You need to explain why the number of units changed, why the unit price changed, and then that will explain why the total change. If it's for a pass-through line item, why did the vendor budget change? Why did the grants change? To this day, there is still a huge gap in how well or whether at all CROs actually describe what's in their change orders at the line item level. It's just not sufficient to say, here's your change order, it's based on these three bullet points. You need to provide line item detail, and it serves two purposes, and it's kind of getting inside baseball in CROs. One, it helps anticipate questions from the client side and helps thus avoid a lot of questions that would otherwise come back. And two, it'll help you find errors and unanticipated, unexpected changes yourself that you did not mean to charge through to a sponsor. Like I said, the vast majority of CRO budgets are in Microsoft Excel, and these are files
and are error-ridden invoices as well.
Yeah. There's a statistic out there that something like 99% of complex Excel workbooks have an error. It's absolutely true. I do this. I do this for a living.
Oh no, I was going to say something about Joel.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I see a definite difference in is with any vendor, but particularly CROs who are aware of this weakness or aware of this challenge. If we think about, okay, there's a change in scope, and it's when things are happening the way that, at least from a Zeus perspective, or from a personal perspective, this is a change. Something is causing a requirement to change, and it can be we need to change a biomarker, we need to add a specific biomarker, or we actually need new patients, or could be all kinds of things, right? It can be this didn't go to what we expected, which is it's clinical development. No one's done it in exactly this format before, which would mean it's always going to need adaptable pieces. The problem is that they're adapting, that everything is so done in hindsight. So, oh yeah, we overspent on this, overspent on that, overspent on this. And since you're now making a change as a sponsor, we're going to add all of this other stuff because we've just measured that we're way behind. Reconciliations are a nightmare because we're actually always in hindsight picking things up. And the difference I see with actually partner vendors, be it partner CROs or vendor CROs, is that there's an accountability and there is there's a mistake there. How would you fix this? That they're checking for the mistakes before they go out rather than, oh, I finally got it from the contracts manager. I'm just going to send it through. And take a look at it. So give the sponsor the homework to actually check for the mistakes, to check for the issues, to check for the questions, what's going to come back.
Yeah, and on the sponsor side, ask for
get the
math.
client to do your work kind of thing. And that creates so much frustration and overwhelmness that at the end of the day, the system financially kind of works that way still. And I'm seeing change, which makes me happy. But we've got a way to go.
Now, in terms of bad forecasting versus things that just happen, just an example Sarah was talking to me about last week was they expected that a large oncology trial going to have a 50% rate of SAEs. Nobody knows. Can't look at completed trials they started 5 years ago. Different standards of care, different everything. Doesn't matter if they had the same standards of care. Doesn't matter if it was a carbon copy protocol. Doesn't matter if the protocol was last year. Never going to be the same. It's going to be different patients. It's going to be different people, different sites involved on the trial. So that 50% ended up being 100%. And so they're talking to me about it. I was like, well, just make sure you're charging the same per SAE as you did in the original contract. It's enough to get a change order that changes the number of SAEs from 100 to 200. That's another thing if that's combined with some wonky change in the unit price per SAE that the sponsor's not expecting. Having the 50% SAE rate and it being 100%, that's usually not going to be bad forecasting. Everybody knows that's an estimate. It's when other parts of your pricing change that can't be explained without good reason where you start to get in trouble.
You get lack of trust and lack of transparency and lack of control. And I think that even with your example, I think one of the things, because I love reading your posts and articles, I'm always learning something because you look at exactly the same point, the interaction, right? You work in the space where your clients, the vendors, the CROs are interacting financially with my clients. Right. And so whenever I'm reading, I'm listening and thinking, oh, this is how Joel sees. This is interesting. It gives me insights. Right. But one of the things that I think is so hugely frustrating and so hugely important from the sponsor point of view, but should also be within the CRO point of view, is being able to signal these changes and trends as early as possible so that we start talking about the fact that it actually is 100%, or it actually is, we're tracking now not to the 50, but we're tracking to the 100. What does that mean? We're going to have to do a change order and then we're going to use the same cost, but this is what it is, was unexpected. Where else are we actually tracking under? But the actual control of a CRO of what they are spending and what they are doing. And I get it. It's complex. I've sat in a phase 3 bid defense with that had actually 3 studies, and I was watching the entire CRO arm. We were in teams. There was 23 people on that call, and that wasn't the sponsor. And I'm thinking, and this is a very big one, right? And all I kept thinking is, this is running a multi-million-dollar company and setting it up on the basis of a contract, on the basis of a proposal. Yeah. The complexity is very, very large and needs a lot to manage. I think one of the things I would love and I would hope for our future is that there is a next step in evolution from the CRO side to in control of the budgets, control of the expenditure, being able to give that transparency and stop saying it's in control. You're the only ones that are struggling, but it actually isn't. Because if everything we're going in hindsight and we know we're going to fight when money is spent that we don't know about, then let's avoid that and be in control of what's going on and actually say, hey, there's something going on there that's going to impact us financially. Let's talk about it. Not a bad thing. But Joel, I want to finish because I think otherwise we could talk for hours. And maybe actually I'm going to use this moment to extend an invitation for another one in the future, because this is always good. I would love to have more chats with you in the podcast. So hopefully in the future, you'd be willing to rejoin me.
I would. And I'd like to use this moment to hype up your newsletter, which is one of the very, very few out there that focus on what you do, which is how to interact and manage CROs, but also just other service providers across the industry. There's very little like it. I've always felt there was a huge opportunity for someone to do that. And I love that you in particular are doing it. So, anyone here who's not signed up to your newsletter, make that the first thing you do after you're done with this podcast.
Yeah, I'm so happy and proud of the team we've built over the last 14 years. And we probably were way too early. In 2012, people were like, literally, that sounds interesting. It sounds like something that's really valid, but we spent a lot of years driving the awareness. I'm very excited for the need, the appetite, the understanding of why this is important. So Joel, thanks for that. I look forward to the future and keep on learning from each other, and hope to have you back in the podcast someday.
Same here.
Thank you everyone for joining, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Cut the Chat Life Science Insider. Make sure you're following SUS Plus on LinkedIn and be the first to know about upcoming podcasts.